that he developed as students, our icons have this to say.
I think I was a rather undisciplined student. I read a lot of books. I tried to make copious notes on books, which I think is an unwise thing to do. One should make notes, but one shouldn't make too many, because there are lots of books to read, and if you make copious notes, how are you going to remember them? So that was one habit I developed, not a very good one. I hope I have corrected it later, because I would like to say here that I regard myself as having been a student all my life. I have gone on all through my life reading books, all kinds of books, especially in my fields of interest. History has been one of them, and then later English studies and linguistics.
I always, as I regarded the lectures as signposts, but the real work, as I said, was when you went into the library to read the journal articles, to read the books, and reflect. You know, things as simple, in quotes, as Shakespeare's plays. We had an American lecturer who just had a master's degree, but was very good. And so, you know, Hamlet, for example, he would make you debate endlessly on issues arising out of Hamlet. And then if you went to the Shakespeare Quarterly, you would actually find articles discussing those issues from different perspectives, so which would now enrich your own perspective when you came to discuss during tutorials. So it was very, very interesting, and I developed the habit of really studying hard and widely, you know, to cover the topics in more depth.
My study habits I developed long before I got to UCI. At the St. Andrews College, Oyo, which was a teacher training institution, I developed the habit of studying on my own. And it's not just me alone. All the students in that institution learned to study on their own. They would go to a place, quiet place under the tree, and sit down and study on their own. So when I got to UCI, and I found that what was the teaching was simply no notes, just lectures given, you took notes, list of books for you to go and read, it suited the way I was used to studying. Unlike some of the people who came from the grammar schools who were used to taking notes, I found myself at an advantage in that regard. And so immediately after every lecture, I would go to the library and take a look at the books recommended. And from there, make my own notes. I made sure that after every lecture, I made notes. So that was the way I prepared myself for in the course. Yeah.
I lived all my 4 years at Glasgow University in a hall of residence. And the routine was, I suppose, applicable to everybody. You had breakfast, you went to the university for your lectures, and in between lectures you retired into the library, and then you came home for lunch at about 1 o'clock in the hall, and then went back to the university to have tutorials or lectures. If not, then you spent part of the rest of the day in the library, and then you came home you came to the hall of residence for supper, for dinner really, because there's a distinction there, for dinner at about 6:30, and then they really spoilt us, because from 9 o'clock onwards until the following morning, there's a separate supper room where food was available. You know, gallons of milk, tea, sandwiches. So if you are working late into the night and you are feeling hungry, you came down and had a snack. Or if you went to the cinema and came back very late, you can always go into the supper room and help yourself. And that way, the whole thing was, it exerted minimum stress on all of us. And looking back now, I think we were really spoiled rotten. I don't think even in 2016 that universities in Britain still spoiled students like that. But we were privileged and we had all the opportunities.
English literature has been said by many to be central to English studies. The icons explain the impact of literature and English studies.
African literature was just being introduced. It was like 1 or 2 courses. Not now that it has become central. So, well, I think it was a good thing to have a good introduction to the core English literature itself. Although, when I went to do my master's and PhD studies in the UK, I realized that we were still not doing anything near what was being done in the UK, because if you did an English degree in the UK, you would start from Chaucer's time, cover the whole period and jars, and then get on to the modern period. So that, you know, a graduate of English from an English university in those days, I don't know, they may have changed the curriculum too, you know, was well versed in the whole area and genres of English. But we didn't have Chaucer. I think it was, the earliest was Shakespeare, and then some 18th century like Jane Austen and Dickens, people like that. And then for poetry, people like Eliot and so on. But it was good. It was good. It's tougher than African literature. But then you see, if you were equipped with the skills to read those texts sensitively, then you would be better equipped to interpret African literature.
The degree that I earned says English language and literature. Well, you would have thought that perhaps language was more important than literature because it's put first in that title. But actually the central part of the course was literature. There was this practice then, we all went in for literature, of course, the core courses in literature, beginning from Anglo-Saxon onwards. But at some point, those of us who were interested in language, particularly, had to attend different classes for tutorials and so on. But I would say that the literature thing still loomed very, very large in the curriculum at the time that I was studying there. But there wasn't any artificial distinction between language and literature because, as I said, we studied Anglo-Saxon. Well, that's part of English literature, but we studied it as part of language as well, in studying the way in which the English language has developed, starting with a text like Beowulf in the 7th century, and then you went into Middle English. You saw how the language was altering, was changing under the influence of the Norse invasions from Northern Europe, people settling in. And then you had the Norman conquest in 1066, and a great deal of French influence was poured into you. Well, you studied this at every stage until you came to Chaucer, and the real beginning of English literature. Then you went on to 17th century poetry, 18th century poetry, modern poetry. One advantage was that we had from time to time some of the most famous living writers coming to talk to us. W.H. Auden, for example, I remember very well because he was a very spectacular figure. So one had the opportunity of discussing with some of these very important people. And to tell the truth, when I finished, I didn't think I was going to end up as a professor of English language. Now, but that's one thing which I keep remembering in the language class. We had a lecturer called Dr. Blakely, very, very interesting person, a Yorkshire man. And our tutorials we were doing Anglo-Saxon and so on and so forth. And he used to say from time to time, I don't know where he got the insight from time to time he would say, well, of all of you here, I'm sure Banjo is going to be a professor of language before any of you. And it's turned out to be correct in his prophecy. But it wasn't until I got back to Nigeria that I had the opportunity of going back for postgraduate studies in language rather than literature. And that's where my career in English language started.
I believe that if one is going to become a master of English, one should be in contact with the greatest books that have been read and written over the years, and that means the great classics of English literature. And I'm sorry that in Nigeria, over the years, the reading of the great classics of English literature seems to have been rather at a discount. And I try to encourage people to read as widely as possible, and that means reading some of the great classics of literature as well. So at Cambridge in the early 60s, if one read a degree in English, it was indeed, yes, English literature. And somebody who dominated the scene in those days was a scholar called Leavis, who believed strongly in some central works of English literature that had a moral purpose, novelists such as Henry James, D.H. Lawrence. And so if you read English, you had to read and master these novels. That was the atmosphere of English studies in Cambridge in those days, with very, very little attention given to the study of English language as such. I think I should point out that at that time, English linguistics was not very much developed. It's something that has come about in the last 50 or 60 years. Even there's been a revolution in English studies, English language studies as a result. But in those days, everything was very much literature-centered.
The centrality of English literature was useful in the sense that it improved your knowledge of English a lot. And I'm talking of things like vocabulary. The average person who has been able to go through the course that we went through will be very comfortable writing in English, reading in English, and culturally being aware of what has happened in the development of English itself. Where there was a little disadvantage was that in my time, there was little attention paid to English language. And I believe that has now been corrected. But from what I hear, it seems as if it's now gone to the other extreme of not having enough English literature. I don't think that is good. We need to be able to have enough literature because that's what is going to help creativity in the students.
Teachers are assumed to be models to their students. The icons of English studies are models to many other models by virtue of their training, experience, and dedication. They spoke on their own experiences with the teachers who were models to them.
Yes, well, I've talked about Peter Alexander. I can never I can never forget him. He was a Regius professor, and you know, in Britain, to be a Regius professor was very top. At the time he was teaching me, must have been nearly 70 years old. He had a very beautiful head of hair, gray, and he walked into the lecture hall. You know, in those days, lecturers must wear their gowns to give lectures. And he would walk into the lecture room, not holding anything, not a piece of paper. And he would just lean on the table in front of him and start, not referring to anything at all, reeling out dates and being extremely familiar with trends in English literature. Of course, when you talk about Shakespeare, this is the very man who was, I think the other person who rivaled him a little bit was the man at least called Wilson Knight. That was the one who taught Soyinka, because that Soyinka took his degree from Leeds. But these were the leading lights. And one was really inspired. The profession of teaching in universities was made very appealing to all of us. And on the language side as well, I talked about Dr. Blakely. He presented a very, very friendly face of academics to us. And Norman Davis, who probably was the leading scholar of Anglo-Saxon of this time. Actually, the year that I graduated from Glasgow, he got the coveted chair in Oxford, Martin Professor of English Language. So we had these people to inspire us, and we thought that we would like to be like them. So it's not surprising that many of us went out to do well for ourselves.
I think naturally, in any program in which you are, your teachers must be a model of some sort. I have known cases where students get to the point that they even begin to talk like their teachers. In my case, I believe being exposed to English by the different lecturers that we had also affected me, and I saw them as models. But it wasn't just at that level that I had noticed this. Even before I got to UCI, I was teaching at St. Luke's College, Ibadan, where Canon later Adenike Akinjobi, the father of Professor Emeritus Ayobanjo, was the principal. And his spoken English was such that it was something beyond what his contemporaries had in those days. It was from him that I learned that the word students was now students, but students. And, you know, this was strange at that time, but he was someone who was a model to me even before I got to UCI. But certainly in UCI, my lecturers in English also influenced me.
My teachers, some of them were great models to me, especially teachers in secondary school. And chief amongst them was a man called Daniel O'Connell, who taught history, but also he insisted on the great importance of style, of good stylistic expression in writing history, in writing anything. So I owe a very great deal to him.
Yes, I believe they were. They were very hardworking, and because of their different backgrounds, as I said, there were Canadians, Americans, British people, Indians, all sorts of backgrounds. So, you know, they really stimulated us. We didn't have very senior people like PhDs and professors, but they were mostly holders of master's degrees, but they were good. They worked hard. Students were few, and the lectures were very, very thorough.
The icons of English studies in Nigeria are successful academics. They talked about their career journey and how they became academics.
Before I came into academics, in fact, even before I came to UCI as an undergraduate, I had worked as a teacher for a number of years. I studied at the St. Andrews College, Oyo, from 1948 to 1951. And between 1952 and 1957, I had taught in primary schools, in secondary schools, in teacher training colleges before I got admission to the university. But since I graduated from the University College Ibadan in 1960 and went for postgraduate training in Edinburgh, obtaining my PhD in 1963. I had been in academics since 1963 non-stop until I retired in 1990 with further extension after my retirement till 1992. So really, my whole period there was in academics.
After I finished at Cambridge in 1962, I was something at a loss as to what to do with my life. I suppose the big idea I had was that I wanted to write books, to write fiction. But one couldn't just sit down and write books. How would you feed yourself? It's a question that many writers face. And then I won't go into more detail about what happened at the time because it's quite complicated, but a friend, a dear friend, an undergraduate friend, said to me, "Why not go and teach overseas for a while?" I said to him, "All right, where should I go?" And he said, "Well, you know, there are many independent countries in Africa." This was 1963, let us remember. "Why not go and teach there for a while?" And I said, "All right, which country shall I go to?" So he said, "Well, you know so-and-so." So I contacted this person whom I had earlier got to know, and one thing led to another, and I was quickly fixed up with a teaching post at a new Anglican grammar school in what is now Delta State. It was then the Midwest region. The region had just been created in 1963, and so I came out to teach at this school at a place called Ubulukwu, which is now in the Igbo-speaking part of Delta State. So that was really how I became involved in the teaching of English. I taught other subjects as well, history, which was the subject of my degree, Latin, and some other subjects, literature. And I spent 2 years on contract at that school, and on the whole, it was a most wonderful experience. I realized that I must come back to Nigeria, and so I came out to teach at a place called the Dennis Memorial Grammar School, Onitsha. While I was there, the Civil War approached, and the schools all had to close down, and I and other expatriate teachers had to leave and go back to Britain. That was in 1967. where for the first time in my life I taught English as a foreign language. That was a different experience from teaching it in Nigeria, where, as we know, English counts as a second language. English is the general language. It was a very different situation in Libya. And in 1974, as an education officer with the Federal Ministry of Education, teaching at one of the new FATCs, as they were called in those days, Federal Advanced Teachers Colleges. And I went to teach at Okene in what is now Kogi State. From there, in 1981, I got transferred to the Federal College of Education, Pankshin, in Plateau State. In 1987, I was able to get a senior lectureship at Bayero University, Kano. And I stayed many, many years in Kano. I became a professor there in 2002. But by 2004, 2005, the opportunity came to move to the University of Jos. And so 2006, early 2006, I took up a new post at Jos. In the meantime, I had risen to the rank of professor. I became a professor at Bayero in 2002. And so I came to Jos in 2005, 2006 as a professor, and that is where I still am.
If I make a distinction between teaching generally, especially at a secondary school, and teaching at a university, which is where you can consider yourself an academic, right? What happened was when I finished in 1960, actually I got my degree from Glasgow in 1959, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with this degree? So I said, as a form of insurance, I would go and do the postgraduate certificate in education. So I moved from Glasgow to Leeds and did the postgraduate diploma in education. I then went to the Nigeria office in London to say I was ready to go home and I was looking for a job. And they referred me to the Western, what was then Western Nigeria. And they offered me the job of an education officer. So that's the very first job I was offered. But I was a bit delayed in returning home, because when I got home, what I was told was that the intention of the government was to make me education officer in broadcasting. I think the person in that post who was just leaving it was Christopher Collady, who also had been an education officer. So, but by the time I came, I was told that that post had been filled. And so I was sent off to a teacher training college in what was then the Midwest. It wasn't even the Midwest yet, it was part of the Western region, Abraka Teacher Training College. That's a university there now. And I got there, and I was teaching, of course, basically literature. But after being there for 6 months, I was then summoned to go to Government College Ughelli, where I was told the English results had been disastrous in that year. And so off I went to Ughelli, and that was where the political developments in Nigeria caught up with me. The Midwest state was about to be set up, and people who did not originate from that part were being sent back to their home states. So you can say I've experienced being a refugee myself, because I was sent out of the place. And I was relocated to Government College Ibadan, where I had the honor of teaching a lot of very prominent Nigerians now, but among them Femi Oshofison was one of my students there. The British Council and the State Department in America were jointly offering scholarships for people to do postgraduate work. partly at the University of Leeds and partly at UCLA, the University of California. So when I then moved to UCLA to finish off what would then be MA in linguistics, I suddenly got a letter from the head of department of English at the University of Ibadan, a man called Desmond Maxwell, who wrote out of the blue to me to say, "We have heard of your performance at Leeds, and we are thinking of establishing a language alternative to the literature program being offered at Ibadan. And we are trying to recruit people to do this. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Well, of course I would be interested." So Desmond Maxwell then said to me, "On your way back home, can I have a meeting with you in London?" And I said, "Yes, very well." And you won't believe it. The place where we had the interview was the waiting room of Waterloo railway station. We just went in there and he started talking to me. At that time, I may tell you, the staff of Ibadan, whether British or whatever, or Nigerian, spent all their summers in Britain. In fact, there have been times when the final results were taken in Britain rather than here in Ibadan. So everybody was there, more or less. So Desmond Maxwell said, "Meet me at the waiting room of the Waterloo station." So I went there and talked to him. And he said, "Oh, very good. Okay, when you get home, go to the registrar of the University of Ibadan. Your letter of appointment will be waiting for you." And that's how it all started.
As I said, I went to a teacher training college, and at that time, if you finished in December, the 1st of January, 2nd of January, you reported to the local education authority, where they would post you to give you a job and post you to some primary school. So I was given a job and I was posted to a primary school in one of the local government areas of Kano State at the time. I taught for about 6 months there, and then there was a training program a crash program for training people that they called pupil teachers, people who had primary education but were teaching in primary schools. They were untrained, and so there was a program to convert them to grade 2 teachers within a period of 3 years through a combination of tuition and also practical work in their schools. So I was selected as one of the pioneer lecturers of that program. So I was transferred from the village back to the city where I taught, and well, just for a few months before my admission to the university was confirmed, and so I left. So it was just a 9-month stint as a grade 2 teacher, but for career purposes, I took a leave of absence from the local education authority to study for my bachelor's degree, at the end of which I was offered a job by the university, ABU at the time, and so I then applied for the transfer of my service because you see, technically the period of study leave was also part of the service. Even the NYSC period was part of the service. So the period was now transferred to the university, and this helped me when I came to retire much later in 2006.
Our distinguished icons were at a point in their lives young scholars, and gradually they evolved to established scholars. They share their experiences as young scholars and as established scholars.
The first admission I have to make is that I'm not aware that I became an established scholar at any time. I'm still learning, I'm still researching, I'm still looking for solutions to problems. But I think what you mean is after a while one gets accepted as perhaps knowing a little bit more than most people. And that means, of course, that one was called upon to do all sorts of things. WAEC invited me to to be chairman of the Oral English panel for the West African Exams Council Oral English. Then, of course, one got invited to be external examiner to a whole lot of universities, practically all the universities in existence in the 70s, leading up to Furabe, University of Furabe in Sierra Leone, Botswana, Swaziland, and so on. So I suppose that's the sign of being established. My services were required in all these places, and one also one had the opportunity at a time when going on study leave and on sabbatical was more or less automatic at the University of Ibadan. Every 3 years, one had a chance of going out somewhere and meeting other scholars. And then, of course, one's research became not just limited to oneself, but it became a way of helping budding scholars to do their own PhDs and so on. So this is what one has been doing, and through this one has been able to travel all over Nigeria, and all over Africa, and to Britain, and I've had sabbatical leave as far away as in Norway. So this is what one does. One tries to help younger academics to fulfill themselves, and that's the reason why that's the reason why you are able to visit me in this room today. I may inform you that when I first joined the Department of English in 1966, this was the room assigned to me, and I've kept this room for 50 years.
I first became a university lecturer at what we call BUK, Bayero University, Kano, in 1987. And already I was 46 years old, so you might say that I was middle-aged, but at the same time I was a young scholar, because earlier I had taught in colleges of education. So it was when I came to BUK in 1987 that I began to have to develop as a scholar in different ways, not only through teaching courses, which I had been doing for many years, but also in supervising students at undergraduate level and then postgraduate level. I had to start thinking of conference participation, and then, yes, I had to begin to think of publishing papers, books, if possible as well, if I wanted to become promoted.
As a young scholar, it was important that one should make a mark. And I decided early on that I had to do well in my career, and the challenges were there. Heavy teaching load, and yet you needed to do research. So I decided that I was going to concentrate a lot, not only on my teaching, but also on my research. So I did a lot of research and branched into several areas. And but after graduating in linguistics at the University of Edinburgh, I regarded myself as a language expert. But because I had to introduce courses in the Yoruba language, I found myself going back to literature, for instance, teaching about D.O. Fagunwa, since there was no one else to teach that kind of course. When one becomes an established scholar, the sky is the limit. I still remember the thrill I had with getting my first article in a learned journal, reading the proofs, and feeling elated that here was me in print and I could see my name. But that was the beginning. But once I became an established scholar, people looked for me. I didn't have to look for them. Invitations to come to conferences, to come and give keynote addresses, to come and contribute to books. In fact, I had more than I could cope with. And the strange thing is that even at this age of mine, people still want me to come and talk to them. They still want me to contribute to books and so on.
I don't know if I'm yet an established scholar. When my teachers are still alive and still active, I really still feel like a little boy, still learning at their feet. But if you mean professorship status, having joined the professoriate, you are regarded as a senior academic. Yeah, well, it's a different challenge. Most people, go to sleep after the carpenter has finished constructing their chair. Well, I would like to think that I'm not one of those. I'm still active, still writing. Unfortunately, in the last 10, 15 years, I haven't written much on Nigerian English. Because you see, my job at NUC, opened new doors for me in other areas of academic endeavor, namely higher education, which is a very big field. Since I was practically managing the Nigerian university system, I was continuously being invited to contribute chapters and articles on Nigerian higher education. So now I have almost as many publications in that area as in my own area of English studies.